For several years, I have always gone shopping on Black Friday. But the most terrifying incident I've ever had happened 2 years ago. On Thanksgiving Day, I was eager to go shopping for a new television. It was 7 p.m., and Walmart was launching a large sale on gadgets, so I had planned to go there. My parents had several of our relatives from my mom's side of the family over while I was at my parents' house. I had conversations with everyone before we all ate supper together. Then I departed from their home and went to Walmart to buy a huge television. Around 20 minutes before Walmart opened, I got there. I observed that there was already a sizable queue of individuals waiting to enter, but it didn't last very long. And I believed there was still a good possibility I would receive the TV I desired. I exited my car and joined the line toward the rear. And as I was getting in line, I noticed a couple more folks behind me. The doors to Walmart were being opened, so I stood in line for the final minutes. I observed his entourage enter the building. I then hurried with everybody else. And as I entered, I immediately headed for the electronics section. It was challenging to maneuver through the congested store, but I managed to get there in a short amount of time without bumping into anyone or anything like that. When I arrived at the television, I noticed that a few individuals had already gotten the full HD model and brand I had wished for. I moved swiftly in their direction. And while I was doing it, I observed someone else take one to show that there was simply one more behind it. I swiftly extended my hand to grab the final one. I was overjoyed to hold it. I was rather anxious that I'd be able to acquire it. I was aware of their speed. I likely had complete control of it for a couple of seconds. I was holding the television in my arms when someone entered from my left side and seized it. Before I could catch it and bring it back, it began to fall out of my hands. When the individual slightly nudged me at that moment, I almost dropped the television. I swung around to see a man with a light mustache and a gray hoodie. He was observing me, and as we locked eyes, he said that his television was mine. I apologized to the guy. The last one, though, was mine. The man turned and proceeded to go, but he suddenly made a complete 180 degrees turn and returned to me. Then he pleaded with me to give it to him. I apologized for not wanting to and said no. Then he explained to me how someone had blocked his path and prevented him from reaching the television sooner. Then he said, I also assumed I had arrived at the television before you. I was ahead of the man even though I saw that he was behind me. After I had it in my possession, he attempted to take it away from me. Even though I didn't want to make a scene, I was just not planning to offer him the last television. I apologized to him once again and then walked toward the check lines. He pursued me the entire way there to persuade me. He got more furious the further we traveled. I finally started ignoring him at that point. I at last reached the checkered lane. He then went away after cursing at me. I packed my car after checking out and strolled past the television to the parking area. However, I noticed the man starting to approach me once again as I was loading my television into my car. This time, I felt uneasy. In the parking area, where there were fewer individuals, the mood was odd. I quickly closed the door after hastening up. I could see the man scolding me from roughly 15 feet away, and he stepped inside a neighboring parked vehicle. Since I was aware of the fantastic bargain I was receiving on television, I chose to ignore him, even though I secretly felt awful for the guy behind me. I was aware that I did not have to hand him the last one, though. I turned the ignition on my automobile and accelerated. To deliver the television, I took my car back to my residence. Both my parents' home and mine were close to Walmart. A car made a turn in my direction as I entered my street, and I saw it. The automobile then came to a stop in front of my driveway as I was about to turn into it. I experienced a dreadful emotion. The vehicle then began to honk. I turned to look and noticed the Walmart employee shouting something out his window. Then, driving quickly, he left. I felt relieved when he left. Given that he now knew where I lived, I felt a bit uneasy. To get so stirred up over television, the guy sounded a bit nuts. I carried my television inside. I shut it up after that and spent the remainder of Thanksgiving with my parents. I remained there till about 10 o'clock, and then I drove home. I simply felt uneasy. I was concerned that the man had attempted to do anything like break into my house while I was away. But I believed that I was simply being crazy. At first glance, everything at my location appeared fine as I searched for my vehicle. I stepped outside and moved toward the entrance. But when I approached my door, which was around 10 feet away, I observed a thing. In front of my house, I had a few columns, and behind the left pillar's side, I noticed what seemed like an arm. I knew it had to be them. I intended to go, but I did not want to be seen as running away. I abruptly came to a stop and murmured, left my mobile to myself. I had some faith that it would. I spun around and quietly began to make my way back to my car. The guy seems to accept it. I desperately wanted to dash to my car, but I chose to maintain my composure. The man was not audible or apparent to me at all. I could only endure that for so long until I approached my vehicle, which was approximately 10 feet away. I burst into a sprint and continued running. I noticed the individual chasing after me as I got to my car. I instantly climbed inside and took off as swiftly as I could. I sensed something strike the car while I was doing it. It appeared to be a rock. I returned home. My parents told my folks everything. My car's side had a noticeable ding in it. I spent the night there, and we also phoned the police. I do not even believe that the individual was ever apprehended, though, but at least he ceased communicating with me. Roughly 6 years ago, on Black Friday, something occurred. In my third year of college, I was an impressionable woman, 20 years old, living somewhat near my school. As a result, I was able to find employment at a clothes store in a big shopping center that was close by. Black Friday was on the program, as it had been the year before. I anticipated that the shift would be quite hectic and long. However, I was also aware that I would be paid more, so it was worthwhile. On the day of Black Friday, I arrived at work early and was there when we opened at 7 a.m. The business where I worked was rather large. As a result, we had a large workforce. I had various jobs in addition to working as a cashier. Soon after we opened, I was ringing up customers at the register when a man entered my queue and checked out. He was bearded and in his mid-30s. He also was missing a front tooth, as I recall, the moment he was there. He seemed to be fixedly looking at me the entire time. And he complimented me on my attire, while also giving off a little unsettling vibe. But I was polite to him since I understood that that was simply part of the job. He then departed. I switched from working as a teller to the women's section about an hour later. We were very busy, but not to the point where people were waiting outside or anything, so I once again spotted the men while I was sorting some clothing. But compared to previous days, we were really busy. Therefore, I thought it was weird that an hour later, I encountered the same guy again. The thing that bothered me the most, though, was that I once again found him just gazing at me. He turned aside hastily when we locked eyes. He appeared to be nearly hidden behind a shelf of clothing. I tried my best to keep my mouth shut. The guy ultimately vanished. The man returned around 10 minutes later. In the same location, I was still sorting clothing. However, the man walked up to me this time. He inquired as to my plans for the evening. I only answered, "I do not even know," instead of responding to him. Then he inquired if I wanted to accompany him. "No apologies," I said. He then took hold of my arm. He advised that we simply depart. I was genuinely surprised by this, and I let out a little bit of a shout. I urged him to stop grabbing me. That's when the man released his grip on me when a few people saw me. Then he quickly went away. I then notified a colleague about it, but the person had vanished. I thus believed he was permanently gone. But I saw him again a little while later, about 5 hours later. He was also gazing at me. By this time, I was certain that the person was tracking me in some way, and I had some doubts that he would be around after I departed. In approximately an hour, I would be leaving. I only prayed that when I was through, I would still not run into the guy. And I didn't see him until 15 minutes before my flight. I asked a coworker to accompany me as I walked to my car. I was quite relieved that the guy did not pursue me as I drove home. Fortunately, the guy did not pursue me when I arrived home. But later that evening, I heard a tap at my front door, which woke me up. Just in time, I shared a home with my parents, but since they were all asleep, I knew it was not them or my little brother. Initially perplexed, I lay there until I suddenly recalled the guy who had been following me around the store. I then felt an extremely unsettling sense. I did not want to get up and even open the window to look outside. I was relieved to hear my brother exiting his bedroom. He spoke aloud. As he proceeded, he pondered why someone would pound on the door at this time, 2:00 a.m. My brother was probably still occupied with computer games, I suppose. I could hear him approaching the door. At that time, I got up to follow him and check on who else was there before returning to my room. Like I did, there was no one there, as my brother informed me. Then he let himself out of the door. After taking a glance around and gathering something from the floor, you went back inside. I noticed he was carrying an envelope once I went inside. You cracked it open and took out 2 snap photos. Both of these were views from my workplace. The other was from my bedroom window. I was very scared when I realized what I had just done. I described the individual to my brother. He left the envelope, and I'm certain of it. Both of us awakened my parents, and the police were then summoned. I did end up responding to numerous questions and completing a report. I had a couple of weeks off work coming up. To my astonishment, the individual was later apprehended after being discovered visiting the business again the following day. I visited Walgreens on Black Friday 2017 to check out the specials they were offering. I was seeking to purchase a few items, nothing large like a television, but a few little things and some Christmas presents for individuals. When I arrived there around twilight, the shop was rather crowded. To see a supermarket that full at night was strange. I had a peek around, but the shop was so congested that it was difficult to move around. The doors to the storeroom briefly blocked my path. They contained a tiny window, and I happened to be aimlessly scanning it to find the back rooms. As I was doing so, I saw somebody entering the rear, but it was not an employee. They were all in black with ski masks on. I assumed that it had to be a prank or something. I chose to tell the worker who was standing nearby about the situation. I informed him that a man in the rear was donning a ski mask. He asked me to suggest where he was after giving me an amazing look. He unlocked the door when I pointed toward the window and inquired about our movements inside the rear room. He became much calmer back there as the people dispersed. I turned my attention in the person's direction. I also said that he was heading in that direction. I'd only started moving in that way. I sensed somebody grasping me from the back and putting their palm over my eyes. Gloves appeared to be on them. My legs were then grasped by another person. The following day, I realized that at least 2 guys were picking me up. They moved me a short distance before dropping me into what I perceived to be one of those enormous waste bins on wheels. I landed on a trash bag. I raised my head and saw 2 men wearing ski masks. I was being pushed while being instructed to stop talking. I questioned how that could be happening without anyone noticing. I had limited vision. However, I saw that a door going outdoors was open as we passed it. I'm not sure what changed me. However, I immediately felt as though I needed to take action. I then leaped against the edge, which caused the trash cans I was in to fall over. I slipped out of it, got to my feet, and started running. They came up behind me. I could feel it. I eventually made it out the door and turned left to get to the front of the shop. We were at the location where nobody else was. I then ran as quickly as I could. The guys gave up pursuing me after I returned to the front. I sprinted to my vehicle and made the entire trip home. When I arrived, I called the cops. I realized I ought to have contacted them sooner. However, my thoughts were racing and I simply wanted to return home, where I felt comfortable. However, when I contacted, I was informed that there had been further reports of individuals wearing ski masks at that Walgreens. I had no idea what those guys were doing, but I'm so grateful I was able to flee. Several years ago, on Black Friday, this occurred. It was surrounded by all of the busy Black Friday shopping. In order to look at laptops, I headed to Priceline. A new computer and potentially a laptop were also things I intended to purchase. They were most likely the sought-after item that was being sold there that day. I thus arrived a few minutes prior and stood in line. Many other folks were also waiting. As a result, I packed a seat and some latex gloves and used my smartphone to play cards and view YouTube while I waited. I recall a man with long brown hair leaning behind me. He didn't look at me the whole time but stood there opposite me. I once questioned him about how he was doing, but he remained silent. He gave me not a single glance. The longer it went on, the more uncomfortable and odd it looked. Eventually, the shop doors opened, and everyone hurried inside to use the computers. I stayed there for about 40 minutes before leaving and taking the items to my vehicle. They were placed in the front seat of the car before I turned around and entered it. However, as soon as I sat down and turned on the engine, the guy who had been in line behind me appeared in my rearview mirror. In the rear of my vehicle, he was seated. I rushed back inside to Priceline after jumping out of the vehicle out of sheer panic. I pulled out my mobile and dialed 911. I later returned to the parking area once I had collected myself, but my vehicle had vanished. When I discovered I had left the car when the keys were inside, the cops had just arrived. We spoke, or the man was likely trying to rob me, so I suppose he took my belongings. Simply by luck, I am unharmed. However, the following day I received a call informing me that my car had been discovered approximately 3 kilometers with both of my laptops still inside.